Chapter 71 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 71 Bread and Salt. Madame de Morcerf entered an archway of trees with her companion. It led through a grove of lindens to a conservatory. "It was too warm in the room, was it not, Count?" she asked. "Yes, madame, and it was an excellent idea of yours to open the doors and the blinds." As he ceased speaking, the Count felt the hand of Mercédès tremble. "But you," he said, "with that light dress and without anything to cover you but that gauze scarf, perhaps you feel cold." "Do you know where I am leading you?" said the Countess, without replying to the question. "No, madame," replied Monte Cristo, "but you see I make no resistance." "We are going to the greenhouse that you see at the other end of the grove." The Count looked at Mercédès as if to interrogate her, but she continued to walk on in silence, and he refrained from speaking. They reached the building, ornamented with magnificent fruits, which ripen at the beginning of July in the artificial temperature which takes the place of the sun, so frequently absent in our climate. The Countess left the arm of Monte Cristo and gathered a bunch of muscatel grapes. "See, Count," she said with a smile so sad in its expression that one could almost detect the tears on her eyelids. "See, our French grapes are not to be compared, I know, with yours of Sicily and Cyprus. But you will make allowance for our northern sun." The Count bowed, but stepped back. "Do you refuse?" said Mercédès in a tremulous voice. "Pray excuse me, madame," replied Monte Cristo, "but I never eat muscatel grapes." Mercédès let them fall and sighed. A magnificent peach was hanging against an adjoining wall, ripened by the same artificial heat. Mercédès drew near and plucked the fruit. "Take this peach, then," she said. The Count again refused. "What? Again?" she exclaimed, in so plaintive an accent that it seemed to stifle a sob. "Really, you pain me." A long silence followed. The peach, like the grapes, fell to the ground. "Count," added Mercédès with a supplicating glance, "there is a beautiful Arabian custom which makes eternal friends of those who have eaten together bread and salt under the same roof." "I know it, madame," replied the Count, "but we are in France and not in Arabia, and in France eternal friendships are as rare as the custom of dividing bread and salt with one another." "But," said the Countess breathlessly, with her eyes fixed on Monte Cristo, whose arm she convulsively pressed with both hands, "we are friends, are we not?" The Count became pale as death. The blood rushed to his heart, and then again rising, dyed his cheeks with crimson. His eyes swam like those of a man suddenly dazzled. "Certainly, we are friends," he replied. "Why should we not be?" The answer was so little like the one Mercédès desired that she turned away to give vent to a sigh, which sounded more like a groan. "Thank you," she said, and they walked on again. They went the whole length of the garden without uttering a word. "Sir," suddenly exclaimed the Countess, after their walk had continued 10 minutes in silence, "is it true that you have seen so much, travelled so far, and suffered so deeply?" "I have suffered deeply, madame," answered Monte Cristo. "But now you are happy?" "Doubtless," replied the Count, "since no one hears me complain." "And your present happiness, has it softened your heart?" "My present happiness equals my past misery," said the Count. "Are you not married?" asked the Countess. "I married!" exclaimed Monte Cristo, shuddering. "Who could have told you so?" "No one told me you were, but you have frequently been seen at the opera with a young and lovely woman." "She is a slave whom I bought at Constantinople, madame, the daughter of a prince. I have adopted her as my daughter, having no one else to love in the world." "You live alone, then?" "I do." "You have no sister, no son, no father?" "I have no one." "How can you exist thus, without anyone to attach you to life?" "It is not my fault, madame. At Malta I loved a young girl, was on the point of marrying her, when war came and carried me away. I thought she loved me well enough to wait for me, and even to remain faithful to my memory. When I returned, she was married. This is the history of most men who have passed 20 years of age. Perhaps my heart was weaker than the hearts of most men, and I suffered more than they could have done in my place. That is all." The Countess stopped for a moment, as if gasping for breath. "Yes," she said, "and you have still preserved this love in your heart. One can only love once. And did you ever see her again?" "Never." "Never?" "I never returned to the country where she lived." "To Malta?" "Yes, Malta." "She is, then, now at Malta?" "I think so." "And have you forgiven her for all she has made you suffer?" "Her? Yes." "But only her. Do you then still hate those who separated you?" "I hate them? Not at all. Why should I?" The Countess placed herself before Monte Cristo, still holding in her hand a portion of the perfumed grapes. "Take some," she said. "Madam, I never eat muscatel grapes," replied Monte Cristo, as if the subject had not been mentioned before. The Countess dashed the grapes into the nearest thicket with a gesture of despair. "Inflexible man!" she murmured. Monte Cristo remained as unmoved as if the reproach had not been addressed to him. Albert at this moment ran in. "Oh, mother!" he exclaimed, "such a misfortune has happened!" "What? What has happened?" asked the Countess, as though awakening from a sleep to the realities of life. "Did you say a misfortune? Indeed, I should expect misfortunes." "Monsieur de Villefort is here." "Well?" "He comes to fetch his wife and daughter." "Why so?" "Because Madame de Saint-Méran is just arrived in Paris, bringing the news of Monsieur de Saint-Méran's death, which took place on the first stage after he left Marseille. Madame de Villefort, who was in very good spirits, would neither believe nor think of the misfortune, but Mademoiselle Valentine, at the first words, guessed the whole truth. Notwithstanding all the precautions of her father, the blow struck her like a thunderbolt, and she fell senseless." "And how was Monsieur de Saint-Méran related to Mademoiselle de Villefort?" said the Count. "He was her grandfather on the mother's side. He was coming here to hasten her marriage with France." "Ah, indeed. So France must wait. Why was not Monsieur de Saint-Méran also grandfather to Mademoiselle Danglars?" "Albert, Albert," said Madame de Morcerf in a tone of mild reproof, "what are you saying? Ah, Count, he esteems you so highly. Tell him that he has spoken amiss." And she took 2 or 3 steps forward. Monte Cristo watched her with an air so thoughtful and so full of affectionate admiration that she turned back and grasped his hand. At the same time she seized that of her son and joined them together. "We are friends, are we not?" she asked. "Oh, madame, I do not presume to call myself your friend, but at all times I am your most respectful servant." The Countess left with an indescribable pang in her heart, and before she had taken 10 steps, the Count saw her raise her handkerchief to her eyes. "Do not my mother and you agree?" asked Albert, astonished. "On the contrary," replied the Count. "Did you not hear her declare that we were friends?" They re-entered the drawing-room which Valentine and Madame de Villefort had just quitted. It is perhaps needless to add that Morrel departed almost at the same time. End of chapter 71. Chapter 72 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 72. Madame de Saint-Méran. A gloomy scene had indeed just passed at the house of Monsieur de Villefort. After the ladies had departed for the ball, whither all the entreaties of Madame de Villefort had failed in persuading him to accompany them, the procureur had shut himself up in his study, according to his custom, with a heap of papers calculated to alarm anyone else, but which generally scarcely satisfied his inordinate desires. But this time the papers were a mere matter of form. Villefort had secluded himself, not to study, but to reflect. And with the door locked and orders given that he should not be disturbed excepting for important business, he sat down in his armchair and began to ponder over the events, the remembrance of which had during the last 8 days filled his mind with so many gloomy thoughts and bitter recollections. Then, instead of plunging into the mass of documents piled before him, he opened the drawer of his desk, touched a spring, and drew out a parcel of cherished memoranda, amongst which he had carefully arranged, in characters only known to himself, the names of all those who either in his political career, in money matters, at the bar, or in his mysterious love affairs, had become his enemies. Their number was formidable. Now that he had begun to fear, and yet these names, powerful though they were, had often caused him to smile with the same kind of satisfaction experienced by a traveller who from the summit of a mountain beholds at his feet the craggy eminences, the almost impassable paths, and the fearful chasms through which he has so perilously climbed. When he had run over all those names in his memory, again read and studied them, commenting meanwhile upon his lists, he shook his head. "No," he murmured, "none of my enemies would have waited so patiently and laboriously for so long a space of time, that they might now come and crush me with this secret. Sometimes, as Hamlet says, foul deeds will rise, though all the earth o'erwhelm them to men's eyes. But, like a phosphoric light, they rise but to mislead. The story has been told by the Corsican to some priest, who in his turn has repeated it. Monsieur de Monte Cristo may have heard it, and to enlighten himself— But why should he wish to enlighten himself upon the subject?" asked Villefort, after a moment's reflection. "What interest can this Monsieur de Monte Cristo, or Monsieur Zaccone, son of a shipowner of Malta, discover of a mine in Thessaly, now visiting Paris for the first time? What interest, I say, can he take in discovering a gloomy, mysterious, and useless fact like this? However, among all the incoherent details given to me by the Abbé Busoni, and by Lord Wilmore, by that friend and that enemy, one thing appears certain and clear in my opinion, that in no period, in no case, in no circumstance, could there have been any contact between him and me." But Villefort uttered words which even he himself did not believe. He dreaded not so much the revelation, for he could reply to or deny its truth. He cared little for that mean tekel upharsin, which appeared suddenly in letters of blood upon the wall. But what he was really anxious for was to discover whose hand had traced them. While he was endeavouring to calm his fears, and instead of dwelling upon the political future that had so often been the subject of his ambitious dreams, was imagining a future limited to the enjoyments of home, in fear of awakening the enemy that had so long slept, the noise of a carriage sounded in the yard. Then he heard the steps of an aged person ascending the stairs, followed by tears and lamentations, such as servants always give vent to when they wish to appear interested in their master's grief. He drew back the bolt of his door, and almost directly an old lady entered, unannounced, carrying her shawl on her arm and her bonnet in her hand. The white hair was thrown back from her yellow forehead, and her eyes, already sunken by the furrows of age, now almost disappeared beneath the eyelids swollen with grief. "Oh, sir," she said. "Oh, sir, what a misfortune! I shall die of it. Oh, yes, I shall certainly die of it." And then, falling upon the chair nearest the door, she burst into a paroxysm of sobs. The servants standing in the doorway, not daring to approach nearer, were looking at Noirtier's old servant, who had heard the noise from his master's room, and run there also, remaining behind the others. Villefort rose and ran towards his mother-in-law, for it was she. "Why, what can have happened?" he exclaimed. "What has thus disturbed you? Is Monsieur de Saint-Méran with you?" "Monsieur de Saint-Méran is dead," answered the old Marchioness, without preface and without expression. She appeared to be stupefied. Villefort drew back, and clasping his hands together, exclaimed, "Dead? So suddenly?" "A week ago," continued Madame de Saint-Méran, "we went out together in the carriage after dinner. Monsieur de Saint-Méran had been unwell for some days. Still, the idea of seeing our dear Valentine again inspired him with courage, and notwithstanding his illness, he would leave. At 6 leagues from Marseille, after having eaten some of the lozenge he is accustomed to take, he fell into such a deep sleep that it appeared to me unnatural. Still, I hesitated to wake him, although I fancied that his face was flushed, and that the veins of his temples throbbed more violently than usual. However, as it became dark and I could no longer see, I fell asleep. I was soon aroused by a piercing shriek as from a person suffering in his dreams, and he suddenly threw his head back violently. I called the valet. I stopped the postilion. I spoke to Monsieur de Saint-Méran. I applied my smelling salts. But all was over, and I arrived at Aix by the side of a corpse." Villefort stood with his mouth half open, quite stupefied. "Of course you sent for a doctor?" "Immediately, but as I have told you, it was too late." "Yes, but then he could tell of what complaint the poor Marquis had died." "Oh, yes, sir. He told me. It appears to have been an apoplectic stroke." "And what did you do then?" "Monsieur de Saint-Méran had always expressed a desire, in case his death happened during his absence from Paris, that his body might be brought to the family vault. I had him put into a leaden coffin, and I am preceding him by a few days." "Oh, my poor mother," said Villefort, "to have such duties to perform at your age after such a blow." "God has supported me through all. And then, my dear Marquis, he would certainly have done everything for me that I performed for him. It is true that since I left him, I seem to have lost my senses. I cannot cry. At my age they say that we have no more tears. Still, I think that when one is in trouble one should have the power of weeping. Where is Valentine, sir? It is on her account I am here. I wish to see Valentine." Villefort thought it would be terrible to reply that Valentine was at a ball, so he only said that she had gone out with her stepmother, and that she should be fetched. "This instant, sir, this instant, I beseech you," said the old lady. Villefort placed the arm of Madame de Saint-Méran within his own, and conducted her to his apartment. "Rest yourself, mother," he said. The Marchioness raised her head at this word, and beholding the man who so forcibly reminded her of her deeply regretted child, who still lived for her in Valentine, she felt touched at the name of mother, and bursting into tears, she fell on her knees before an armchair where she buried her venerable head. Villefort left her to the care of the women, while old Barrois ran, half scared, to his master, for nothing frightens old people so much as when death relaxes its vigilance over them for a moment in order to strike some other old person. Then, while Madame de Saint-Méran remained on her knees, praying fervently, Villefort sent for a cab, and went himself to fetch his wife and daughter from Madame de Morcerf's. He was so pale when he appeared at the door of the ballroom that Valentine ran to him, saying, "Oh, father, some misfortune has happened." "Your grandmamma has just arrived, Valentine," said Monsieur de Villefort.
"And grandpapa?"
inquired the young girl, trembling with apprehension. Monsieur de Villefort only replied by offering his arm to his daughter. It was just in time, for Valentine's head swam and she staggered. Madame de Villefort instantly hastened to her assistance and aided her husband in dragging her to the carriage, saying,
"What a singular event! Who could have thought it? Ah, yes, it is indeed strange."
And the wretched family departed, leaving a cloud of sadness hanging over the rest of the evening. At the foot of the stairs, Valentine found Barrois awaiting her. "Monsieur Noirtier wishes to see you tonight," he said in an undertone.
"Tell him I will come when I leave my dear grandmamma,"
she replied, feeling with true delicacy that the person to whom she could be of the most service just then was Madame de Saint-Méran. Valentine found her grandmother in bed. Silent caresses, heart-wrung sobs, broken sighs, burning tears were all that passed in this sad interview, while Madame de Villefort, leaning on her husband's arm, maintained all outward forms of respect, at least towards the poor widow. She soon whispered to her husband,
"I think it would be better for me to retire with your permission, for the sight of me appears still to afflict your mother-in-law."
Madame de Saint-Méran heard her.
"Yes, yes," she said softly to Valentine. "Let her leave. But do you stay."
Madame de Villefort left, and Valentine remained alone beside the bed, for the procureur, overcome with astonishment at the unexpected death, had followed his wife. Meanwhile, Barrois had returned for the first time to old Noirtier, who, having heard the noise in the house, had, as we have said, sent his old servant to inquire the cause. On his return, his quick, intelligent eye interrogated the messenger. "Alas, sir," exclaimed Barrois, "a great misfortune has happened. Madame de Saint-Méran has arrived, and her husband is dead." Monsieur de Saint-Méran and Noirtier had never been on strict terms of friendship. Still, the death of one old man always considerably affects another. Noirtier let his head fall upon his chest, apparently overwhelmed and thoughtful. Then he closed one eye in token of inquiry. "Mademoiselle Valentine?" Noirtier nodded his head. "She is at the ball, as you know, since she came to say good-bye to you in full dress." Noirtier again closed his left eye. "Do you wish to see her?" Noirtier again made an affirmative sign. "Well, they have gone to fetch her, no doubt, from Madame de Morcerf's. I will await her return, and beg her to come up here. Is that what you wish for?" "Yes," replied the invalid. Barrois, therefore, as we have seen, watched for Valentine, and informed her of her grandfather's wish. Consequently, Valentine came up to Noirtier on leaving Madame de Saint-Méran, who, in the midst of her grief, had at last yielded to fatigue and fallen into a feverish sleep. Within reach of her hand they placed a small table upon which stood a bottle of orangeade, her usual beverage, and a glass. Then, as we have said, the young girl left the bedside to see Monsieur Noirtier. Valentine kissed the old man, who looked at her with such tenderness that her eyes again filled with tears, whose sources he thought must be exhausted. The old gentleman continued to dwell upon her with the same expression.
Yes, yes, said Valentine. You mean that I have yet a kind grandfather left, do you not?
The old man intimated that such was his meaning.
Ah, yes, happily I have, replied Valentine. Without that, what would become of me?
It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Barrois, who wished to go to bed himself, observed that after such sad events everyone stood in need of rest. Noirtier would not say that the only rest he needed was to see his child, but wished her a good night, for grief and fatigue had made her appear quite ill. The next morning she found her grandmother in bed. The fever had not abated. On the contrary, her eyes glistened, and she appeared to be suffering from violent nervous irritability.
"Oh, dear grandmamma, are you worse?" exclaimed Valentine, perceiving all these signs of agitation. "No, my child, no," said Madame de Saint-Méran. "But I was impatiently waiting for your arrival, that I might send for your father."
"My father?" inquired Valentine uneasily.
"Yes, I wish to speak to him."
Valentine durst not oppose her grandmother's wish, the cause of which she did not know, and an instant afterwards Villefort entered.
"Sir,"
said Madame de Saint-Méran, without using any circumlocution, and as if fearing she had no time to lose,
"you wrote to me concerning the marriage of this child."
"Yes, madame," replied Villefort. "It is not only projected, but arranged."
"Your intended son-in-law is named Monsieur Franz d'Épinay."
"Yes, madame."
"Is he not the son of General d'Épinay, who was under our side and who was assassinated some days before the usurper returned from the island of Elba?"
"The same."
"Does he not dislike the idea of marrying the granddaughter of a Jacobin?"
"Our civil dissensions are now happily extinguished, mother," said Villefort. "Monsieur d'Épinay was quite a child when his father died. He knows very little of Monsieur Noirtier, and will meet him, if not with pleasure, at least with indifference."
"Is it a suitable match?"
"In every respect."
"And the young man?"
"He is regarded with universal esteem."
"You approve of him?"
"He is one of the most well-bred young men I know." During the whole of this conversation Valentine had remained silent.
"Well, sir,"
said Madame de Saint-Méran, after a few minutes' reflection,
"I must hasten the marriage, for I have but a short time to live."
"You, madame? You, dear mamma?" exclaimed Monsieur de Villefort and Valentine at the same time.
"I know what I am saying,"
continued the Marchioness.
"I must hurry you, so that, as she has no mother, she may at least have a grandmother to bless her marriage. I am all that is left to her belonging to my poor Renée, whom you have so soon forgotten, sir."
"Oh, madame," said Villefort, "you forget that I was obliged to give a mother to my child."
"A stepmother is never a mother, sir. But this is not to the purpose. Our business concerns Valentine. Let us leave the dead in peace."
All this was said with such exceeding rapidity that there was something in the conversation that seemed like the beginning of delirium. "It shall be as you wish, madame," said Villefort, "more especially since your wishes coincide with mine. And as soon as Monsieur d'Épinay arrives in Paris—"
"My dear grandmother," interrupted Valentine, "consider decorum, the recent death. You would not have me marry under such sad auspices." "My child," exclaimed the old lady sharply, "let us hear none of the conventional objections that deter weak minds from preparing for the future. I also was married at the deathbed of my mother, and certainly I have not been less happy on that account."
"Still, that idea of death, madame," said Villefort.
"Still, always. I tell you I am going to die. Do you understand? Well, before dying, I wish to see my son-in-law. I wish to tell him to make my child happy. I wish to read in his eyes whether he intends to obey me. In fact, I will know him. I will," continued the old lady with a fearful expression, "that I may rise from the depths of my grave to find him, if he should not fulfil his duty."
"Madame," said Villefort, "you must lay aside these exalted ideas, which almost assume the appearance of madness. The dead, once buried in their graves, rise no more."
"And I tell you, sir, that you are mistaken. This night I have had a fearful sleep. It seemed as though my soul were already hovering over my body. My eyes, which I tried to open, closed against my will. And what will appear impossible above all to you, sir, I saw with my eyes shut, in the spot where you are now standing, issuing from that corner where there is a door leading into Madame Villefort's dressing-room. I saw, I tell you, silently enter a white figure."
Valentine screamed. "It was the fever that disturbed you, madame," said Villefort.
"Doubt, if you please, but I am sure of what I say. I saw a white figure, and as if to prevent my discrediting the testimony of only one of my senses, I heard my glass removed, the same which is there now on the table."
"Oh, dear mother, it was a dream."
"So little was it a dream that I stretched my hand toward the bell, but when I did so, the shade disappeared. My maid then entered with a light."
"But she saw no one."
"Phantoms are visible to those only who ought to see them. It was the soul of my husband. Well, if my husband's soul can come to me, why should not my soul appear to guard my granddaughter? The tie is even more direct, it seems to me."
"Oh, madame," said Villefort, deeply affected in spite of himself, "do not yield to these gloomy thoughts. You will long live with us, happy, loved, and honoured, and we will make you forget—"
"Never, never, never,"
said the Marchioness.
"When does Monsieur d'Épinay return?"
"We expect him every moment."
"It is well. As soon as he arrives, inform me. We must be expeditious. And then I also wish to see a notary, that I may be assured that all our property returns to Valentine." "Oh, grandmamma," murmured Valentine, pressing her lips on the burning brow, "do you wish to kill me? Oh, how feverish you are! We must not send for a notary, but for a doctor." "A doctor?" said she, shrugging her shoulders. "I am not ill. I am thirsty, that is all." "What are you drinking, dear grandmamma?" "The same as usual, my dear. My glass is there on the table. Give it to me, Valentine."
Valentine poured the orangeade into a glass and gave it to her grandmother with a certain degree of dread, for it was the same glass she fancied that had been touched by the spectre. The Marchioness drained the glass at a single draught, and then turned on her pillow, repeating, "The notary, the notary." Monsieur de Villefort left the room, and Valentine seated herself at the bedside of her grandmother. The poor child appeared herself to require the doctor she had recommended to her aged relative. A bright spot burned in either cheek. Her respiration was short and difficult, and her pulse beat with feverish excitement. She was thinking of the despair of Maximilian when he should be informed that Madame de Saint-Méran, instead of being an ally, was unconsciously acting as his enemy. More than once she thought of revealing all to her grandmother, and she would not have hesitated a moment if Maximilien Morel had been named Albert de Morcerf or Raoul de Château-Renaud. But Morel was of plebeian extraction, and Valentine knew how the haughty Marquise de Saint-Méran despised all who were not noble. Her secret had each time been repressed when she was about to reveal it, by the sad conviction that it would be useless to do so, for were it once discovered by her father and mother, all would be lost. 2 hours passed thus. Madame de Saint-Méran was in a feverish sleep, and the notary had arrived. Though his coming was announced in a very low tone, Madame de Saint-Méran arose from her pillow.
"The notary!" she exclaimed. "Let him come in."
The notary, who was at the door, immediately entered.
"Go, Valentine," said Madame de Saint-Méran, "and leave me with this gentleman." "But, grandmamma—" "Leave me. Go."
The young girl kissed her grandmother and left with her handkerchief to her eyes. At the door she found the valet de chambre, who told her that the doctor was waiting in the dining-room. Valentine instantly ran down. The doctor was a friend of the family, and at the same time one of the cleverest men of the day, and very fond of Valentine, whose birth he had witnessed. He had himself a daughter about her age, but whose life was one continued source of anxiety and fear to him from her mother having been consumptive.
"Oh," said Valentine, "we have been waiting for you with such impatience, dear Monsieur d'Avrigny. But first of all, how are Madeleine and Antoinette?"
Madeleine was the daughter of Monsieur d'Avrigny, and Antoinette his niece. Monsieur d'Avrigny smiled sadly. "Antoinette is very well," he said, "and Madeleine tolerably so. But you sent for me, my dear child. It is not your father or Madame de Villefort who is ill. As for you, although we doctors cannot divest our patients of nerves, I fancy you have no further need of me than to recommend you not to allow your imagination to take too wide a field." Valentine coloured. Monsieur d'Avrigny carried the science of divination almost to a miraculous extent, for he was one of the physicians who always work upon the body through the mind.
"No," she replied, "it is for my dear grandmother." "You know the calamity that has happened to us, do you not?"
"I know nothing," said Monsieur d'Avrigny.
"Alas!" said Valentine, restraining her tears, "my grandfather is dead."
"Monsieur de Saint-Méran?"
"Yes."
"Suddenly?"
"From an apoplectic stroke."
"An apoplectic stroke?" repeated the doctor.
"Yes, and my poor grandmother fancies that her husband, whom she never left, has called her, and that she must go and join him." "Oh, Monsieur d'Avrigny, I beseech you, do something for her."
"Where is she?"
"In her room with the notary."
"And Monsieur Noirtier?"
"Just as he was, his mind perfectly clear, but the same incapability of moving or speaking."
"And the same love for you, eh, my dear child?"
"Yes," said Valentine. "He was very fond of me."
"Who does not love you?" Valentine smiled sadly. "What are your grandmother's symptoms?"
"An extreme nervous excitement and a strangely agitated sleep. She fancied this morning in her sleep that her soul was hovering above her body, which she at the same time watched. It must have been delirium. She fancies, too, that she saw a phantom enter her chamber, and even heard the noise it made on touching her glass."
"It is singular," said the doctor. "I was not aware that Madame de Saint-Méran was subject to such hallucinations."
"It is the first time I have ever saw her in this condition," said Valentine, "and this morning she frightened me so that I thought her mad. And my father, who you know is a strong-minded man, himself appeared deeply impressed."
"We will go and see," said the doctor. "What you tell me seems very strange." The notary here descended, and Valentine was informed that her grandmother was alone.
"Go upstairs," she said to the doctor.
"And you?"
"Oh, I dare not. She forbade me sending for you, and, as you say, I am myself agitated, feverish, and out of sorts. I will go and take a turn in the garden to recover myself."
The doctor pressed Valentine's hand, and while he visited her grandmother she descended the steps. We need not say which portion of the garden was her favourite walk. After remaining for a short time in the parterre surrounding the house, and gathering a rose to place in her waist or hair, she turned into the dark avenue which led to the bench. Then from the bench she went to the gate. As usual, Valentine strolled for a short time among her flowers, but without gathering them. The mourning in her heart forbade her assuming this simple ornament, though she had not yet had time to put on the outward semblance of woe. She then turned towards the avenue. As she advanced, she fancied she heard a voice speaking her name. She stopped, astonished. Then the voice reached her ear more distinctly, and she recognized it to be that of Maximilian. End of chapter 72. Chapter 73 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 73 The Promise. It was, indeed, Maximilien Morrel who had passed a wretched existence since the previous day. With the instinct peculiar to lovers, he had anticipated after the return of Madame de Saint-Méran and the death of the Marquis that something would occur at Monsieur de Villefort's in connection with his attachment for Valentine. His presentiments were realized, as we shall see, and his uneasy forebodings had goaded him pale and trembling to the gate under the chestnut trees. Valentine was ignorant of the cause of this sorrow and anxiety, and as it was not his accustomed hour for visiting her, she had gone to the spot simply by accident, or perhaps through sympathy. Morrel called her, and she ran to the gate. "You are here at this hour," said she. "Yes, my poor girl," replied Morrel. "I come to bring and to hear bad tidings." "This is indeed a house of mourning," said Valentine. "Speak, Maximilien, although the cup of sorrow seems already full." "Dear Valentine," said Morrel, endeavouring to conceal his own emotion, "listen, I entreat you. What I am about to say is very serious. When are you to be married?" "I will tell you all," said Valentine. "From you I have nothing to conceal. This morning the subject was introduced, and my dear grandmother, on whom I have depended as my only support, not only declared herself favourable to it, but is so anxious for it that they only await the arrival of Monsieur d'Épinay, and the following day the contract will be signed." A deep sigh escaped the young man, who gazed long and mournfully at her he loved. "Alas," replied he, "it is dreadful thus to hear my condemnation from your own lips. The sentence is passed, and in a few hours will be executed. It must be so, and I will not endeavour to prevent it. But since you say nothing remains but for Monsieur d'Épinay to arrive, that the contract may be signed, and the following day you will be his. Tomorrow you will be engaged to Monsieur d'Épinay, for he came this morning to Paris." "Oh!" Valentine uttered a cry. "I was at the house of Monte Cristo an hour since," said Morrel. "We were speaking, he of the sorrow your family had experienced, and I of your grief, when a carriage rolled into the courtyard. Never till then had I placed any confidence in presentiments, but now I cannot help believing them. At the sound of that carriage I shuddered. Soon I heard steps on the staircase, which terrified me as much as the footsteps of the commander did Don Juan. The door at last opened. Albert de Morcerf entered first, and I began to hope my fears were vain, when after him another young man advanced, and the Count exclaimed, 'Ah, here is the Baron Franz d'Épinay.' I summoned all my strength and courage to my support. Perhaps I turned pale and trembled, but certainly I smiled, and 5 minutes after I left, without having heard one word that had passed." "Poor Maximilien," murmured Valentine. "Valentine, the time has arrived when you must answer me. And remember, my life depends on your answer. What do you intend doing?" Valentine held down her head. She was overwhelmed. "Listen," said Morrel. "It is not the first time you have contemplated our present position.
which is a serious and urgent one. I do not think it is a moment to give way to useless sorrow. Leave that for those who like to suffer at their leisure and indulge their grief in secret. There are such in the world, and God will doubtless reward them in heaven for their resignation on earth. But those who mean to contend must not lose one precious moment, but first return immediately the blow which fortune strikes. Do you intend to struggle against our ill fortune? Tell me, Valentine, for it is that I came to know."
Valentine trembled and looked at him with amazement. The idea of resisting her father, her grandmother, and all the family had never occurred to her.
"What do you say, Maximilien?" asked Valentine. "What do you mean by a struggle? Oh, it would be sacrilege. What? I resist my father's order and my dying grandmother's wish? Impossible!"
Morel started.
"You are too noble not to understand me, and you understand me so well that you already yield, dear Maximilien. No, no, I shall need all my strength to struggle with myself and support my grief in secret, as you say. But to grieve my father, to disturb my grandfather's last moments, never."
"You are right," said Morel calmly.
"In what a tone you speak!" cried Valentine. "I speak as one who admires you, mademoiselle." "Mademoiselle?" cried Valentine. "Mademoiselle? Oh, selfish man! He sees me in despair and pretends he cannot understand me."
"You mistake. I understand you perfectly. You will not oppose Monsieur Villefort. You will not displease the Marchioness, and tomorrow you will sign the contract which will bind you to your husband."
"But, mon Dieu, tell me, how can I do otherwise?"
"Do not appeal to me, mademoiselle. I shall be a bad judge in such a case. My selfishness will bind me," replied Morel, whose low voice and clenched hands announced his growing desperation.
"What would you have proposed, Maximilien? Had you found me willing to accede?"
"It is not for me to say."
"You are wrong. You must advise me what to do."
"Do you seriously ask my advice, Valentine?"
"Certainly, dear Maximilien. For if it is good, I will follow it. You know my devotion to you."
"Valentine," said Morel, pushing aside a loose plank, "give me your hand in token of forgiveness of my anger. My senses are confused, and during the last hour the most extravagant thoughts have passed through my brain. Oh, if you refuse my advice—"
"What do you advise?"
said Valentine, raising her eyes to heaven and sighing. "I am free," said Maximilien, "and rich enough to support you. I swear to make you my lawful wife before my lips even shall have approached your forehead."
"You make me tremble,"
said the young girl. "Follow me," said Morel. "I will take you to my sister, who is worthy also to be yours. We will embark for Algiers, for England, for America, or, if you prefer it, retire to the country and only return to Paris when our friends have reconciled your family." Valentine shook her head.
"I feared it, Maximilien," said she. "It is the counsel of a madman, and I should be more mad than you, did I not stop you at once with the word impossible, impossible."
"You will then submit to what fate decrees for you, without even attempting to contend with it?" said Morel sorrowfully.
"Yes, if I die."
"Well, Valentine," resumed Maximilien, "I can only say again that you are right. Truly it is I who am mad, and you prove to me that passion blinds the most well-meaning. I appreciate your calm reasoning. It is then understood that tomorrow you will be irrevocably promised to Monsieur Franz d'Épinay, not only by that theatrical formality invented to heighten the effect of a comedy, called the signature of the contract, but your own will?"
"Again You drive me to despair, Maximilian, said Valentine. Again, you plunge the dagger into the wound. What would you do, tell me, if your sister listened to such a proposition?
Mademoiselle, replied Morel with a bitter smile, I am selfish. You have already said so. And as a selfish man I think not of what others would do in my situation, but of what I intend doing myself. I think only that I have known you not a whole year. From the day I first saw you, all my hopes of happiness have been in securing your affection. One day you acknowledged that you loved me, and since that day my hope of future happiness has rested on obtaining you, for to gain you would be life to me. Now I think no more. I say only that fortune has turned against me. I had thought to gain heaven, and now I have lost it. It is an everyday occurrence for a gambler to lose not only what he possesses, but also what he has not. Morel pronounced these words with perfect calmness. Valentine looked at him a moment with her large, scrutinizing eyes, endeavouring not to let Morel discover the grief which struggled in her heart. "But, in a word, what are you going to do?" asked she. "I am going to have the honour of taking my leave of you, mademoiselle, solemnly assuring you that I wish your life may be so calm, so happy, and so full occupied, that there may be no place for me, even in your memory." "Oh," murmured Valentine. "Adieu, Valentine, adieu," said Morel, bowing. "Where are you going?" cried the young girl, extending a hand through the opening and seizing Maximilian by his coat, for she understood from her own agitated feelings that her lover's calmness could not be real. "Where are you going?" "I am going that I may not bring fresh trouble into your family, and to set an example which every honest and devoted man, situated as I am, may follow." "Before you leave me, tell me what you are going to do, Maximilian." The young man smiled sorrowfully. "Speak, speak," said Valentine. "I entreat you." "Has your resolution changed, Valentine?" "It cannot change, unhappy man. You know it must not," cried the young girl. "Then adieu, Valentine." Valentine shook the gate with a strength of which she could not have been supposed to be possessed, as Morel was going away, and passing both her hands through the opening, she clasped and wrung them. "I must know what you mean to do," she said. "Where are you going?" "Oh, fear not," said Maximilian, stopping at a short distance. "I do not intend to render another man responsible for the rigorous fate reserved for me. Another might threaten to seek Monsieur Franz, to provoke him and to fight with him. Oh, that would be folly. What has Monsieur Franz to do with it? He saw me this morning for the first time, and has already forgotten he has seen me. He did not even know I existed when it was arranged by your two families that you should be united. I have no enmity against Monsieur Franz, and promise you the punishment shall not fall on him." "On whom, then? On me?" "On you? Valentine! Oh, heaven forbid! Woman is sacred. The woman one loves is holy." "On yourself, then, unhappy man, on yourself?" "I am the only guilty person, am I not?" said Maximilian. "Maximilian," said Valentine, "Maximilian, come back, I entreat you." He drew near with his sweet smile, and but for his paleness one might have thought him in his usual happy mood. "Listen, my dear, my adored Valentine," said he in his melodious and grave tone. "Those who, like us, have never had a thought for which we need blush before the world, such may read each other's hearts. I never was romantic, and am no melancholy hero. I imitate neither Manfred nor Antony, but without words protestations or vows, my life has entwined itself with yours. You leave me, and you are right in doing so. I repeat it, you are right, but in losing you, I lose my life. The moment you leave me, Valentine, I am alone in the world. My sister is happily married. Her husband is only my brother-in-law, that is, a man whom the ties of social life alone attach to me. No one then longer needs my useless life. This is what I shall do. I will wait until the very moment you are married, for I will not lose the shadow of one of those unexpected chances which are sometimes reserved for us, since Monsieur Franz may, after all, die before that time. A thunderbolt may fall even on the altar as you approach. Nothing appears impossible to one condemned to die, and miracles appear quite reasonable when his escape from death is concerned. I will then wait until the last moment, and when my misery is certain, irremediable, hopeless, I will write a confidential letter to my brother-in-law, another to the prefect of police, to acquaint them with my intention. And at the corner of some wood, on the brink of some abyss, on the bank of some river, I will put an end to my existence, as certainly as I am the son of the most honest man who ever lived in France. Valentine trembled convulsively. She loosened her hold of the gate. Her arms fell by her side, and 2 large tears rolled down her cheeks. The young man stood before her, sorrowful and resolute.
"Oh, for pity's sake," said she, "you will live, will you not?"
"No, on my honour," said Maximilian, "but that will not affect you. You have done your duty, and your conscience will be at rest." Valentine fell on her knees and pressed her almost bursting heart.
"Maximilian," said she, "Maximilian, my friend, my brother on earth, my true husband in heaven, I entreat you, do as I do. Live in suffering. Perhaps one day we may be united."
"Adieu, Valentine," repeated Morel.
"My God!"
said Valentine, raising both her hands to heaven with a sublime expression.
"I have done my utmost to remain a submissive daughter. I have begged, entreated, implored. He has regarded neither my prayers, my entreaties, nor my tears. It is done!"
cried she, willing away her tears and resuming her firmness.
"I am resolved not to die of remorse, but rather of shame. Live, Maximilian, and I will be yours. Say when shall it be? Speak, command, I will obey."
Morel, who had already gone some few steps away, again returned, and, pale with joy, extended both hands towards Valentine through the opening. "Valentine," said he, "dear Valentine, you must not speak thus. Rather let me die. Why should I obtain you by violence, if our love is mutual? Is it from mere humanity you bid me live? I would rather die."
"Truly,"
murmured Valentine.
"who on this earth cares for me, if he does not? Who has consoled me in my sorrow but he? On whom do my hopes rest? On whom does my bleeding heart repose? On him, always on him. Yes, you are right, Maximilian. I will follow you. I will leave the paternal home. I will give up all. Oh, ungrateful girl that I am!"
cried Valentine, sobbing.
"I will give up all, even my dear old grandfather, whom I had nearly forgotten."
"No," said Maximilian, "you shall not leave him. Monsieur Noirtier has evinced, you say, a kind feeling towards me. Well, before you leave, tell him all. His consent would be your justification in God's sight. As soon as we are married, he shall come and live with us.
Instead of one child, he shall have two. You have told me how you talk to him and how he answers you. I shall very soon learn that language by signs. Valentine, I promise you solemnly that instead of despair, it is happiness that awaits us." "Oh, see, Maximilian, see the power you have over me. You almost make me believe you. And yet, what you tell me is madness, for my father will curse me. He is inflexible. He will never pardon me. Now listen to me, Maximilian. If by artifice, by entreaty, by accident, in short, if by any means I can delay this marriage, will you wait?" "Yes, I promise you, as faithfully as you have promised me that this horrible marriage shall not take place, and that if you are dragged before a magistrate or a priest, you will refuse." "I promise you, by all that is most sacred to me in the world, namely, by my mother." "We will wait, then," said Morel. "Yes, we will wait," replied Valentine, who revived at these words. "There are so many things which may save unhappy beings such as we are." "I rely on you, Valentine," said Morel. "All you do will be well done, only if they disregard your prayers. If your father and Madame de Saint-Méran insist that Monsieur de D'Épinay should be called tomorrow to sign the contract, then you have my promise, Maximilian. Instead of signing, I will go to you, and we will fly. But from this moment until then, let us not tempt Providence. Let us not see each other. It is a miracle. It is a providence that we have not been discovered. If we were surprised, if it were known that we met thus, we should have no further resource." "You are right, Valentine, but how shall I ascertain?" "From the notary, Monsieur Deschamps." "I know him." "And for myself, I will write to you. Depend on me. I dread this marriage, Maximilian, as much as you." "Thank you, my adored Valentine. Thank you. That is enough. When once I know the hour, I will hasten to this spot. You can easily get over this fence with my assistance. A carriage will await us at the gate, in which you will accompany me to my sister's. There, living, retired, or mingling in society, as you wish, we shall be enabled to use our power, to resist oppression, and not suffer ourselves to be put to death like sheep, which only defend themselves by sighs." "Yes," said Valentine. "I will now acknowledge you are right, Maximilian. And now are you satisfied with your betrothal?" said the young girl sorrowfully. "My adored Valentine, words cannot express one half of my satisfaction." Valentine had approached, or rather had placed her lips so near the fence that they nearly touched those of Morel, which were pressed against the other side of the cold and inexorable barrier. "Adieu, until we meet again," said Valentine, tearing herself away. "I shall hear from you?" "Yes." "Thanks, thanks, dear love. Adieu." The sound of a kiss was heard, and Valentine fled through the avenue. Morel listened to catch the last sound of her dress brushing the branches, and of her footstep on the gravel, then raised his eyes with an ineffable smile of thankfulness to heaven for being permitted to be thus loved, and then also disappeared. The young man returned home and waited all the evening and all the next day without getting any message. It was only on the following day, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, as he was starting to call on Monsieur Deschamps, the notary, that he received from the postman a small billet, which he knew to be from Valentine, although he had not before seen her writing. It was to this effect: "Tears, entreaties, prayers have availed me nothing. Yesterday, for 2 hours, I was at the church of Saint-Philippe du Roule, and for 2 hours I prayed most fervently. Heaven is as inflexible as man, and the signature of the contract is fixed for this evening at 9 o'clock. I have but one promise and but one heart to give. That promise is pledged to you. That art is also yours. This evening, then, at 9:15, at the gate. Your betrothed, Valentine de Villefort. P.S. My poor grandmother gets worse and worse. Yesterday her fever amounted to delirium. Today her delirium is almost madness. You'll be very kind to me, will you not, Morel, to make me forget my sorrow in leaving her thus? I think 'tis kept a secret from Grandpapa Noirtier that the contract is to be signed this evening.
Morel went also to the notary, who confirmed the news that the contract was to be signed that evening. Then he went to call on Monte Cristo, and heard still more. Franz had been to announce the ceremony, and Madame de Villefort had also written to beg the Count to excuse her not inviting him. The death of Monsieur de Saint-Méran and the dangerous illness of his widow would cast a gloom over the meeting which she would regret should be shared by the Count, whom she wished every happiness. The day before, Franz had been presented to Madame de Saint-Méran, who had left her bed to receive him, but had been obliged to return to it immediately after. It is easy to suppose that Morel's agitation would not escape the Count's penetrating eye. Monte Cristo was more affectionate than ever. Indeed, his manner was so kind that several times Morel was on the point of telling him all. But he recalled the promise he had made to Valentine, and kept his secret. The young man read Valentine's letter 20 times in the course of the day. It was her first, and on what an occasion! Each time he read it, he renewed his vow to make her happy. How great is the power of a woman who has made so courageous a resolution! What devotion does she deserve from him for whom she has sacrificed everything? How ought she really to be supremely loved? She becomes at once a queen and a wife, and it is impossible to thank and love her sufficiently. Morel longed intensely for the moment when he should hear Valentine say, "Here I am, Maximilian. Come and help me." He had arranged everything for her escape. 2 ladders were hidden in the clover field. A cabriolet was ordered for Maximilian alone, without a servant, without lights. At the turning of the first street they would light the lamps, as it would be foolish to attract the notice of the police by too many precautions. Occasionally he shuddered. He thought of the moment when, from the top of that wall, he should protect the descent of his dear Valentine, pressing in his arms for the first time her of whom he had yet only kissed the delicate hand. When the afternoon arrived, and he felt that the hour was drawing near, he wished for solitude. His agitation was extreme. A simple question from a friend would have irritated him. He shut himself in his room and tried to read, but his eye glanced over the page without understanding a word, and he threw away the book, and for the second time sat down to sketch his plan, the ladders and the fence. At length the hour drew near. Never did a man deeply in love allow the clocks to go on peacefully. Morel tormented his so effectually that they struck 8 at 6:30. He then said, "It is time to start. The signature was indeed fixed to take place at 9 o'clock, but perhaps Valentine will not wait for that." Consequently, Morel, having left the Rue Meslay at 8:30 by his timepiece, entered the clover field, while the clock of Saint-Philippe du Roule was striking 8. The horse and cabriolet were concealed behind a small ruin, where Morel had often waited. The night gradually drew on, and the foliage in the garden assumed a deeper hue. Then Morel came out from his hiding-place with a beating heart, and looked through the small opening in the gate. There was yet no one to be seen. The clock struck 8:30, and still another half-hour was passed in waiting, while Morel walked to and fro, and gazed more and more frequently through the opening. The garden became darker still, but in the darkness he looked in vain for the white dress, and in the silence he vainly listened for the sound of footsteps. The house, which was discernible through the trees, remained in darkness, and gave no indication that so important an event as the signature of a marriage contract was going on. Morel looked at his watch, which wanted 9:45. But soon the same clock he had already heard strike 2 or 3 times rectified the error by striking 9:30. This was already half an hour past the time Valentine had fixed. It was a terrible moment for the young man. The slightest rustling of the foliage, the least whistling of the wind attracted his attention and drew the perspiration to his brow. Then he tremblingly fixed his ladder, and, not to lose a moment, placed his foot on the first step. Amidst all these alternations of hope and fear, the clock struck 10.
"It is impossible," said Maximilian, "that the signing of a contract should occupy so long a time without unexpected interruptions. I have weighed all the chances, calculated the time required for all the forms. Something must have happened." And then he walked rapidly to and fro and pressed his burning forehead against the fence. Had Valentine fainted? Or had she been discovered and stopped in her flight? These were the only obstacles which appeared possible to the young man. The idea that her strength had failed her in attempting to escape, and that she had fainted in one of the paths, was the one that most impressed itself upon his mind. "In that case," said he, "I should lose her, and by my own fault." He dwelt on this idea for a moment. Then it appeared reality. He even thought he could perceive something on the ground at a distance. He ventured to call, and it seemed to him that the wind wafted back an almost inarticulate sigh. At last the half-hour struck. It was impossible to wait longer. His temples throbbed violently. His eyes were growing dim. He passed one leg over the wall, and in a moment leapt down on the other side. He was on Villefort's premises, had arrived there by scaling the wall. What might be the consequences? However, he had not ventured thus far to draw back. He followed a short distance close under the wall, then crossed a path, hid, entered a clump of trees. In a moment he had passed through them and could see the house distinctly. Then Morel saw that he had been right in believing that the house was not illuminated. Instead of lights at every window, as is customary on days of ceremony, he saw only a grey mass, which was veiled also by a cloud, which at that moment obscured the moon's feeble light. A light moved rapidly from time to time past 3 windows of the second floor. These 3 windows were in Madame de Saint-Méran's room. Another remained motionless behind some red curtains which were in Madame de Villefort's bedroom. Morel guessed all this. So many times, in order to follow Valentine in thought at every hour in the day, had he made her describe the whole house, that without having seen it, he knew it all. This darkness and silence alarmed Morel still more than Valentine's absence had done. Almost mad with grief, and determined to venture everything in order to see Valentine once more, and be certain of the misfortune he feared, Morel gained the edge of the clump of trees, and was going to pass as quickly as possible through the flower garden, when the sound of a voice, still at some distance, but which was borne upon the wind, reached him. At this sound, as he was already partially exposed to view, he stepped back and concealed himself completely, remaining perfectly motionless. He had formed his resolution. If it was Valentine alone, he would speak as she passed. If she was accompanied, and he could not speak, still he should see her and know that she was safe. If they were strangers, he would listen to their conversation, and might understand something of this hitherto incomprehensible mystery. The moon had just then escaped from behind the cloud which had concealed it, and Morel saw Villefort come out upon the steps, followed by a gentleman in black. They descended and advanced towards the clump of trees, and Morel soon recognized the other gentleman as Dr. d'Avrigny. The young man, seeing them approach, drew back mechanically until he found himself stopped by a sycamore tree in the centre of the clump. There he was compelled to remain. Soon the 2 gentlemen stopped also. "Ah, my dear doctor," said the procureur, "heaven declares itself against my house. What a dreadful death! What a blow! Seek not to console me.
Alas, nothing can alleviate so great a sorrow. The wound is too deep and too fresh. Dead! Dead!" The cold sweat sprang to the young man's brow, and his teeth chattered. Who could be dead in that house, which Villefort himself had called accursed? "My dear Monsieur de Villefort," replied the doctor with a tone which redoubled the terror of the young man, "I have not led you here to console you. On the contrary." "What can you mean?" asked the procureur, alarmed. "I mean that behind the misfortune which has just happened to you, there is another, perhaps still greater." "Can it be possible?" murmured Villefort, clasping his hands. "What are you going to tell me?" "Are we quite alone, my friend?" "Yes, quite. But why all these precautions?" "Because I have a terrible secret to communicate to you," said the doctor. "Let us sit down." Villefort fell rather than seated himself. The doctor stood before him with one hand placed on his shoulder. Morel, horrified, supported his head with one hand, and with the other pressed his heart lest its beating should be heard. "Dead, dead," repeated he within himself, and he felt as if he were also dying. "Speak, doctor, I am listening," said Villefort. "Strike. I am prepared for everything." "Madame de Saint-Méran was doubtless advancing in years, but she enjoyed excellent health." Morel began again to breathe freely, which he had not done during the last 10 minutes. "Grief has consumed her," said Villefort. "Yes, grief, doctor. After living 40 years with the Marquis—" "It is not grief, my dear Villefort," said the doctor. "Grief may kill, although it rarely does, and never in a day, never in an hour, never in 10 minutes." Villefort answered nothing. He simply raised his head, which had been cast down before, and looked at the doctor with amazement. "Were you present during the last struggle?" asked Monsieur de D'avrigny. "I was," replied the procureur. "You begged me not to leave. Did you notice the symptoms of the disease to which Madame de Saint-Méran has fallen a victim?" "I did. Madame de Saint-Méran had 3 successive attacks, at intervals of some minutes, each one more serious than the former. When you arrived, Madame de Saint-Méran had already been panting for breath some minutes. She then had a fit, which I took to be simply a nervous attack, and it was only when I saw her raise herself in the bed, and her limbs and neck appeared stiffened, that I became really alarmed. Then I understood from your countenance there was more to fear than I had thought. This crisis past, I endeavoured to catch your eye, but could not. You held her hand, you were feeling her pulse, and the second fit came on before you had turned towards me. This was more terrible than the first. The same nervous movements were repeated, and the mouth contracted and turned purple." "And at the third, she expired." "At the end of the first attack, I discovered symptoms of tetanus. You confirm my opinion." "Yes, before others," replied the doctor. "But now we are alone." "What are you going to say? Oh, spare me!" "That the symptoms of tetanus and poisoning by vegetable substances are the same." Monsieur de Villefort started from his seat, then in a moment fell down again silent and motionless. Morel knew not if he were dreaming or awake. "Listen," said the doctor. "I know the full importance of the statement I have just made, and the disposition of the man to whom I have made it." "Do you speak to me as a magistrate or as a friend?" asked Villefort. "As a friend, and only as a friend at this moment. The similarity in the symptoms of tetanus and poisoning by vegetable substances is so great that were I obliged to affirm by oath what I have now stated, I should hesitate. I therefore repeat to you, I speak not to a magistrate, but to a friend. And to that friend I say, during the 3/4 of an hour that the struggle continued, I watched the convulsions and the death of Madame de Saint-Méran, and am thoroughly convinced that not only did her death proceed from poison, but I could also specify the poison.
Can it be possible?
The symptoms are marked. Do you see? Sleep, broken by nervous spasms, excitation of the brain, torpor of the nerve centres. Madame de Saint-Méran succumbed to a powerful dose of brucine or of strychnine, which by some mistake, perhaps, has been given to her.
Villefort seized the doctor's hand. "Oh, it is impossible," said he. "I must be dreaming. It is frightful to hear such things from such a man as you. Tell me, I entreat you, my dear doctor, that you may be deceived."
"Doubtless I may, but—"
"But?"
"But I do not think so."
"Have pity on me, doctor. So many dreadful things have happened to me lately that I am on the verge of a madness."
"Has anyone besides me seen Madame de Saint-Méran?"
"No."
"Has anything been sent for from a chemist that I have not examined?"
"Nothing."
"Had Madame de Saint-Méran any enemies?"
"Not to my knowledge."
"Would her death affect anyone's interest?"
"It could not indeed. My daughter is her only heiress, Valentine alone. Oh, if such a thought could present itself, I would stab myself to punish my heart for having for one instant harboured it."
"Indeed, my dear friend," said Monsieur d'Avrigny, "I would not accuse anyone. I speak only of an accident, you understand? Of a mistake. But whether accident or mistake, the fact is there. It is on my conscience and compels me to speak aloud to you. Make inquiry."
"Of whom? How? Of what?"
"May not Barrois, the old servant, have made a mistake, and have given Madame de Saint-Méran a dose prepared for his master?"
"For my father?"
"Yes."
"But how could a dose prepared for Monsieur Noirtier poison Madame de Saint-Méran?"
"Nothing is more simple. You know poisons become remedies in certain diseases of which paralysis is one. For instance, having tried every other remedy to restore movement and speech to Monsieur Noirtier, I resolved to try one last means, and for 3 months I have been giving him brucine, so that in the last dose I ordered for him there were 6 grains. This quantity, which is perfectly safe to administer to the paralyzed frame of Monsieur Noirtier, which has become gradually accustomed to it, would be sufficient to kill another person."
"My dear doctor, there is no communication between Monsieur Noirtier's apartment and that of Madame de Saint-Méran, and Barrois never entered my mother-in-law's room. In short, doctor, although I know you to be the most conscientious man in the world, and although I place the utmost reliance on you, I want, notwithstanding my conviction, to believe this axiom, errare humanum est."
"Is there one of my brethren in whom you have equal confidence with myself?"
"Why do you ask me that? What do you wish?"
"Send for him. I will tell him what I have seen, and we will consult together and examine the body."
"And you will find traces of poison?"
"No, I did not say of poison. But we can prove what was the state of the body. We shall discover the cause of her sudden death, and we shall say, 'Dear Villefort, if this thing has been caused by negligence, watch over your servants. If from hatred, watch your enemies.'"
"What do you propose to me, d'Avrigny?" said Villefort in despair. "So soon as another is admitted into our secret, an inquest will become necessary, and an inquest in my house. Impossible! Still," continued the procureur, looking at the doctor with uneasiness, "if you wish it, if you demand it, why, then it shall be done. But, doctor, you see me already so grieved. How can I introduce into my house so much scandal after so much sorrow? My wife and my daughter would die of it. And I, doctor, You know a man does not arrive at the post I occupy. One has not been king's attorney 25 years without having amassed a tolerable number of enemies. Mine are numerous. Let this affair be talked of. It will be a triumph for them, which will make them rejoice and cover me with shame. Pardon me, doctor, these worldly ideas, were you a priest, I should not dare to tell you, but you are a man, and you know mankind. Doctor, pray recall your words. You have said nothing, have you?
My dear Monsieur de Villefort, replied the doctor, my first duty is to humanity. I would have saved Madame de Saint-Méran, if science could have done it, but she is dead, and my duty regards the living. Let us bury this terrible secret in the deepest recesses of our hearts. I am willing, if anyone should suspect this, that my silence on the subject should be imputed to my ignorance. Meanwhile, sir, watch always. Watch carefully, for perhaps the evil may not stop here, and when you have found the culprit, if you find him, I will say to you, you are a magistrate. Do as you will.
I thank you, doctor, said Villefort with indescribable joy. I never had a better friend than you. And as if he feared Dr. d'Avrigny would recall his promise, he hurried him towards the house. When they were gone, Morrel ventured out from under the trees, and the moon shone upon his face, which was so pale it might have been taken for that of a ghost. I am manifestly protected in a most wonderful but most terrible manner, said he. But Valentine, poor girl, how will she bear so much sorrow? As he thought thus, he looked alternately at the window with red curtains and the 3 windows with white curtains. The light had almost disappeared from the former. Doubtless Madame de Villefort had just put out her lamp, and the night lamp alone reflected its dull light on the window. At the extremity of the building, on the contrary, he saw one of the 3 windows open. A wax light placed on the mantelpiece threw some of its pale rays without, and a shadow was seen for one moment on the balcony. Morrel shuddered. He thought he heard a sob. It cannot be wondered at that his mind, generally so courageous, but now disturbed by the 2 strongest human passions, love and fear, was weakened even to the indulgence of superstitious thoughts. Although it was impossible that Valentine should see him, hidden as he was, he thought he heard the shadow at the window call him. His disturbed mind told him so. This double error became an irresistible reality, and by one of the incomprehensible transports of youth, he bounded from his hiding-place, and with 2 strides, at the risk of being seen, at the risk of alarming Valentine, at the risk of being discovered by some exclamation which might escape the young girl, he crossed the flower garden, which by the light of the moon resembled a large white lake, and having passed the rows of orange trees which extended in front of the house, he reached the step, ran quickly up, and pushed the door, which opened without offering any resistance. Valentine had not seen him. Her eyes, raised towards heaven, were watching a silvery cloud gliding over the azure, its form that of a shadow mounting towards heaven. Her poetic and excited mind pictured it as the soul of her grandmother. Meanwhile, Morrel had traversed the anteroom and found the staircase, which, being carpeted, prevented his approach being heard, and he had regained that degree of confidence that the presence of Monsieur de Villefort even would not have alarmed him. He was quite prepared for any such encounter. He would at once approach Valentine's father and acknowledge all, begging Villefort to pardon and sanction the love which united 2 fond and loving hearts. Morrel was mad. Happily, he did not meet anyone. Now, especially, did he find the description Valentine had given of the interior of the house useful to him. He arrived safely at the top of the staircase, and while he was feeling his way, a sob indicated the direction he was to take. He turned back. A door, partly opened, enabled him to see his road and to hear the voice of one in sorrow.
He pushed the door open and entered. At the other end of the room, under a white sheet which covered it, lay the corpse, still more alarming to Morel since the account he had so unexpectedly overheard. By its side, on her knees, and with her head buried in the cushion of an easy-chair, was Valentine, trembling and sobbing, her hands extended above her head, clasped and stiff. She had turned from the window, which remained open, and was praying in accents that would have affected the most unfeeling. Her words were rapid, incoherent, unintelligible, for the burning weight of grief almost stopped her utterance. The moon, shining through the open blinds, made the lamp appear to burn paler, and cast a sepulchral hue over the whole scene. Morel could not resist this. He was not exemplary for piety. He was not easily impressed. But Valentine, suffering, weeping, wringing her hands before him, was more than he could bear in silence. He sighed and whispered a name, and the head bathed in tears and pressed on the velvet cushion of the chair, a head like that of a Magdalene by Correggio, was raised and turned toward him. Valentine perceived him without betraying the least surprise. A heart overwhelmed with one great grief is insensible to minor emotions. Morel held out his hand to her. Valentine, as her only apology for not having met him, pointed to the corpse under the sheet, and began to sob again. Neither dared for some time to speak in that room. They hesitated to break the silence which death seemed to impose. At length Valentine ventured.
"My dear friend," said she, "how came you here? Alas, I would say you are welcome, had not death opened the way for you into this house." "Valentine," said Morel with a trembling voice, "I had waited since 8:30, and did not see you come. I became uneasy, leapt the wall, found my way through the garden, when voices conversing about the fatal event." "What voices?" asked Valentine. Morel shuddered as he thought of the conversation of the doctor and Monsieur de Villefort, and he thought he could see through the sheet the extended hands, the stiff neck, and the purple lips. "Your servants," said he, "who were repeating the whole of the sorrowful story. From them I learned it all." "But it was risking the failure of our plan to come up here, love." "Forgive me," replied Morel. "I will go away." "No," said Valentine. "You might meet someone. Stay." "But if anyone should come here?" The young girl shook her head. "No one will come," said she. "Do not fear. There is our safeguard," pointing to the bed. "But what has become of Monsieur d'Épinay?" replied Morel. "Monsieur Franz arrived to sign the contract, just as my dear grandmother was dying." "Alas," said Morel with a feeling of selfish joy, for he thought this death would cause the wedding to be postponed indefinitely. "But what redoubles my sorrow," continued the young girl, as if this feeling was to receive its immediate punishment, "is that the poor old lady on her deathbed requested that the marriage might take place as soon as possible. She also, thinking to protect me, was acting against me." "Hark!" said Morel. They both listened. Steps were distinctly heard in the corridor and on the stairs. "It is my father, who has just left his study." "To accompany the doctor to the door?" added Morel. "How did you know it is the doctor?" asked Valentine, astonished. "I imagined it must be," said Morel. Valentine looked at the young man. They heard the street door close. Then Monsieur de Villefort locked the garden door and returned upstairs. He stopped a moment in the anteroom, as if hesitating whether to turn to his own apartment or into Madame de Saint-Méran's. Morel concealed himself behind a door. Valentine remained motionless, grief seeming to deprive her of all fear. Monsieur de Villefort passed on to his own room. "Now," said Valentine, "you can neither go out by the front door nor by the garden.
Morel looked at her with astonishment.
"There is but one way left that is safe," she said. "It is through my grandfather's room."
She rose.
"Come,"
she added. "Where?" asked Maximilian.
"To my grandfather's room."
"I? In Monsieur Noirtier's apartment?"
"Yes."
"Can you mean it, Valentine?"
"I have long wished it. He is my only remaining friend, and we both need his help. Come."
"Be careful, Valentine," said Morel, hesitating to comply with the young girl's wishes. "I now see my error. I acted like a madman in coming here. Are you sure you are more reasonable?"
"Yes,"
said Valentine.
"and I have but one scruple, that of leaving my dear grandmother's remains, which I had undertaken to watch."
"Valentine," said Morel, "death is in itself sacred."
"Yes,"
said Valentine.
"Besides, it will not be for long."
She then crossed the corridor and led the way down a narrow staircase to Monsieur Noirtier's room. Morel followed her on tiptoe. At the door they found the old servant.
"Barrois," said Valentine, "shut the door and let no one come in."
She passed first. Noirtier, seated in his chair and listening to every sound, was watching the door. He saw Valentine, and his eye brightened. There was something grave and solemn in the approach of the young girl which struck the old man, and immediately his bright eye began to interrogate.
"Dear grandfather," said she hurriedly, "you know poor grandmamma died an hour since, and now I have no friend in the world but you."
His expressive eyes evinced the greatest tenderness.
"To you alone, then, may I confide my sorrows and my hopes?"
The paralytic motioned, "Yes." Valentine took Maximilian's hand.
"Look attentively, then, at this gentleman."
The old man fixed his scrutinizing gaze with slight astonishment on Morel.
"It is Monsieur Maximilian Morel," said she, "the son of that good merchant of Marseille, whom you doubtless recollect."
"Yes," said the old man.
"He brings an irreproachable name, which Maximilian is likely to render glorious, since at 30 years of age he is a captain, an officer of the Legion of Honor."
The old man signified that he recollected him.
"Well, grandpapa," said Valentine, kneeling before him and pointing to Maximilian, "I love him, and will be only his. Were I compelled to marry another, I would destroy myself."
The eyes of the paralytic expressed a multitude of tumultuous thoughts.
"You like Monsieur Maximilian Morel, do you not, grandpapa?" asked Valentine.
"Yes."
"And you will protect us, who are your children, against the will of my father?"
Noirtier cast an intelligent glance at Morel as if to say, "Perhaps I may." Maximilian understood him.
"Mademoiselle," said he, "you have a sacred duty to fulfill in your deceased grandmother's room. Will you allow me the honor of a few minutes' conversation with Monsieur Noirtier?"
"That is it," said the old man's eye. Then he looked anxiously at Valentine.
"Do you fear he will not understand?"
"Yes."
"Oh, we have so often spoken of you, that he knows exactly how I talk to you."
Then turning to Maximilian with an adorable smile, although shaded by sorrow,
"He knows everything I know,"
said she. Valentine arose, placed a chair for Morel, requested Barrois not to admit anyone, and having tenderly embraced her grandfather and sorrowfully taken leave of Morel, she went away. To prove to Noirtier that he was in Valentine's confidence and knew all their secrets, Morel took the dictionary, a pen, and some paper, and placed them all on a table where there was a light. "But first," said Morel, "allow me, sir, to tell you who I am, how much I love Mademoiselle Valentine, and what are my designs respecting her." Noirtier made a sign that he would listen. It was an imposing sight to witness this old man, apparently a mere useless burden, becoming the sole protector, support, and adviser of the lovers who were both young, beautiful, and strong. His remarkably noble and austere expression struck Morel, who began his story with trembling. He related the manner in which he had become acquainted with Valentine, and how he had loved her, and that Valentine, in her solitude and her misfortune, had accepted the offer of his devotion. He told him his birth, his position, his fortune, and more than once, when he consulted the look of the paralytic, that look answered, "That is good. Proceed." "And now," said Morel, when he had finished the first part of his recital, "now I have told you of my love and my hopes, may I inform you of my intentions?" "Yes," signified the old man. "This was our resolution. A cabriolet was in waiting at the gate, in which I intended to carry off Valentine to my sister's house, to marry her, and to wait respectfully Monsieur de Villefort's pardon." "No," said Noirtier. "We must not do so?" "No." "You do not sanction our project?" "No." "There is no other way," said Morel. The old man's interrogative eye said, "What?" "I will go," continued Maximilian. "I will seek Monsieur Franz d'Épinay. I am happy to be able to mention this in Mademoiselle de Villefort's absence, and will conduct myself toward him so as to compel him to challenge me." Noirtier's look continued to interrogate. "You wish to know what I will do?" "Yes." "I will find him as I told you. I will tell him the ties which bind me to Mademoiselle Valentine. If he be a sensible man, he will prove it by renouncing of his own accord the hand of his betrothed, and will secure my friendship and love until death. If he refuse, either through interest or ridiculous pride, after I have proved to him that he would be forcing my wife from me, that Valentine loves me and will have no other, I will fight him, give him every advantage, and I shall kill him, or he will kill me. If I am victorious, I will not marry Valentine, and if I die, I am very sure Valentine will not marry him." Noirtier watched with indescribable pleasure this noble and sincere countenance, on which every sentiment his tongue uttered was depicted, adding by the expression of his fine features all that colouring adds to a sound and faithful drawing. Still, when Morel had finished, he shut his eyes several times, which was his manner of saying "No." "No?" said Morel. "You disapprove of this second project, as you did of the first?" "I do," signified the old man. "But what then must be done?" asked Morel. "Madame de Saint-Méran's last request was that the marriage might not be delayed. Must I let things take their course?" Noirtier did not move. "I understand," said Morel. "I am to wait." "Yes." "But delay may ruin our plan, sir," replied the young man. "Alone, Valentine has no power. She will be compelled to submit. I am here almost miraculously, and can scarcely hope for so good an opportunity to occur again. Believe me, there are only the two plans I have proposed to you. Forgive my vanity, and tell me which you prefer. Do you authorize Mademoiselle Valentine to entrust herself to my honour?" "No." "Do you prefer I seek out Monsieur d'Épinay?" "No." "Whence, then, will you come the help we need? From chance?" resumed Morel. "No." "From you?" "Yes."
"You thoroughly understand me, sir. Pardon my eagerness, for my life depends on your answer. Will our help come from you?"
"Yes."
"You are sure of it?"
"Yes." There was so much firmness in the look which gave this answer. No one could at any rate doubt his will, if they did his power.
"Oh, thank you 1,000 times. But how? Unless a miracle should restore your speech, your gesture, your movement, how can you, chained to that armchair, dumb and motionless, oppose this marriage?"
A smile lit up the old man's face, a strange smile of the eyes in a paralysed face.
"Then I must wait?"
asked the young man. "Yes."
"But the contract?"
The same smile returned.
"Will you assure me it shall not be signed?"
"Yes," said Noirtier.
"The contract shall not be signed!" cried Morel. "Oh, pardon me, sir. I can scarcely realize so great a happiness. Will they not sign it?"
"No," said the paralytic. Notwithstanding that assurance, Morel still hesitated. This promise of an impotent old man was so strange that, instead of being the result of the power of his will, it might emanate from enfeebled organs. Is it not natural that the madman, ignorant of his folly, should attempt things beyond his power? The weak man talks of burdens he can raise, the timid of giants he can confront, the poor of treasures he spends. The most humble peasant, in the height of his pride, calls himself Jupiter. Whether Noirtier understood the young man's indecision, or whether he had not full confidence in his docility, he looked uneasily at him. "What do you wish, sir?" asked Morel. "That I should renew my promise of remaining tranquil?" Noirtier's eyes remained fixed and firm, as if to imply that a promise did not suffice. Then it passed from his face to his hands. "Shall I swear to you, sir?" asked Maximilian. "Yes," said the paralytic with the same solemnity. Morel understood that the old man attached great importance to an oath. He extended his hand. "I swear to you on my honour," said he, "to await your decision respecting the course I am to pursue with Monsieur d'Épinay." "That is right," said the old man. "Now," said Morel, "do you wish me to retire?" "Yes." "Without seeing Mademoiselle Valentine?" "Yes." Morel made a sign that he was ready to obey. "But," said he, "first allow me to embrace you as your daughter did just now." Noirtier's expression could not be understood. The young man pressed his lips on the same spot, on the old man's forehead where Valentine's had been. Then he bowed a second time and retired. He found outside the door the old servant to whom Valentine had given directions. Morel was conducted along a dark passage which led to a little door opening on the garden. Soon found the spot where he had entered, with the assistance of the shrubs gained the top of the wall, and by his ladder was in an instant in the clover field, where his cabriolet was still waiting for him. He got in it, and thoroughly wearied by so many emotions, arrived about midnight in the Rue Meslay, threw himself on his bed, and slept soundly. End of chapter 73. Chapter 74 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 74. The Villefort Family Vault. 2 days after, a considerable crowd was assembled towards 10 o'clock in the morning around the door of Monsieur de Villefort's house, and a long file of mourning coaches and private carriages extended along the Faubourg Saint-Honoré and the Rue de la Pépinière. Among them was one of a very singular form, which appeared to have come from a distance. It was a kind of covered wagon, painted black, and was one of the first to arrive. Inquiry was made, and it was ascertained that by a strange coincidence this carriage contained the corpse of the Marquis de Saint-Méran, and that those who had come thinking to attend one funeral would follow two. Their number was great. The Marquis de Saint-Méran was one of the most zealous and faithful dignitaries of Louis XVIII and King Charles X, had preserved a great number of friends, and these, added to the personages whom the usages of society gave Villefort a claim on, formed a considerable body. Due information was given to the authorities, and permission obtained that the two funerals should take place at the same time. A second hearse, decked with the same funereal pomp, was brought to Monsieur de Villefort's door, and the coffin removed into it from the post-wagon. The two bodies were to be interred in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise, where Monsieur de Villefort had long since had a tomb prepared for the reception of his family. The remains of poor Renée were already deposited there, and now, after 10 years of separation, her father and mother were to be reunited with her. The Parisians, always curious, always affected by funereal display, looked on with religious silence, while the splendid procession accompanied to their last abode two of the number of the old aristocracy. the greatest protectors of commerce, and sincere devotees to their principles. In one of the morning coaches, Beauchamp, Debray, and Chateau Renaud were talking of the very sudden death of the Marchioness. "I saw Madame de Saint-Méran only last year at Marseilles when I was coming back from Algiers," said Chateau Renaud. "She looked like a woman destined to live to be 100 years old from her apparent sound health and great activity of mind and body. How old was she?" "France assured me," replied Albert, "that she was 66 years old. But she has not died of old age, but of grief. It appears that since the death of the Marquis, which affected her very deeply, she has not completely recovered her reason." "But of what disease, then, did she die?" asked Debray. "It is said to have been a congestion of the brain, or apoplexy, which is the same thing, is it not?" "Nearly." "It is difficult to believe that it was apoplexy," said Beauchamp. "Madame de Saint-Méran, whom I once saw, was short, of slender form, and of a much more nervous than sanguine temperament. Grief could hardly produce apoplexy in such a constitution as that of Madame de Saint-Méran." "At any rate," said Albert, "whatever disease or doctor may have killed her, Monsieur de Villefort, or rather Mademoiselle Valentine, or still rather our friend Franz, inherits a magnificent fortune, amounting, I believe, to 80,000 livres per annum." "And this fortune will be doubled at the death of the old Jacobin, Noirtier." "This is a tenacious old grandfather," said Beauchamp. "Tenacem propositi verum. I think he must have made an agreement with death to outlive all his heirs, and he appears likely to succeed. He resembles the old conventionalist of '93, who said to Napoleon in 1814, 'You bend because your empire is a young stem, weakened by rapid growth.' Take the Republic for a tutor. Let us return with renewed strength to the battlefield, and I promise you 500,000 soldiers, another Marengo, and a second Austerlitz. Ideas do not become extinct, sire. They slumber sometimes, but only revive the stronger before they sleep entirely." "Ideas and men appear the same to him. On one thing only puzzles me, namely how Franz d'Épinay will like a grandfather who cannot be separated from his wife. But where is Franz?" "In the first carriage with Monsieur de Villefort, who considered him already as one of the family." Such was the conversation in almost all the carriages. These two sudden deaths, so quickly following each other, astonished everyone, but no one suspected the terrible secret which Monsieur d'Avrigny had communicated in his nocturnal walk to Monsieur de Villefort. They arrived in about an hour at the cemetery. The weather was mild but dull, and in harmony with the funeral ceremony. Among the groups which flocked towards the family vault, Chateau Renaud recognized Morel, who had come alone in a cabriolet, and walked silently along the path all bordered with yew trees. "You here?" said Chateau Renaud, passing his arm through the young captain's. "Are you a friend of Villefort's? How is it that I have never met you at his house?" "I am no acquaintance of Monsieur de Villefort's," answered Morel, "but I was of Madame de Saint-Méran." Albert came up to them at this moment with Franz. "The time and place are but ill-suited for an introduction," said Albert. "But we are not superstitious, Monsieur Morel. Allow me to present to you Monsieur Franz d'Épinay, a delightful travelling companion with whom I made the tour of Italy. My dear Franz, Monsieur Maximilian Morel, an excellent friend I have acquired in your absence, and whose name you will hear me mention every time I make an allusion to affection, wit, or amiability." Morel hesitated for a moment. He feared it would be hypocritical to accost in a friendly manner the man whom he was tacitly opposing, but his oath and the gravity of the circumstances recurred to his memory. He struggled to conceal his emotion, and bowed to Franz. "Mademoiselle de Villefort is in deep sorrow, is she not?" said Debray to Franz. "Extremely," replied he. "She looked so pale this morning, I scarcely knew her." These apparently simple words pierced Morrel to the heart. This man had seen Valentine and spoken to her. The young and high-spirited officer required all his strength of mind to resist breaking his oath. He took the arm of Château Renaud and turned towards the vault, where the attendants had already placed the 2 coffins. "This is a magnificent habitation," said Beauchamp, looking towards the mausoleum. "A summer and winter palace. You will in turn enter it, my dear Épinay, for you will soon be numbered as one of the family. I, as a philosopher, should like a little country house, a cottage down there under the trees, without so many free stones over my poor body. In dying, I will say to those around me what Voltaire wrote to Piron, 'Eorus, and all will be over.' But come, Franz, take courage. Your wife is an heiress." "Indeed, Beauchamp, you are unbearable. Politics has made you laugh at everything, and political men have made you disbelieve everything. But when you have the honour of associating with ordinary men, and the pleasure of leaving politics for a moment, try to find your affectionate heart, which you leave with your stick when you go to the chamber." "But tell me," said Beauchamp, "what is life? Is it not a hole in death's anteroom?" "I am prejudiced against Beauchamp," said Albert, drawing Franz away, and leaving the former to finish his philosophical dissertation with Debray. The Villefort vault formed a square of white stones about 20 feet high. An interior partition separated the 2 families, and each apartment had its entrance door. Here were not, as in other tombs, ignoble drawers, one above another, where thrift bestows its dead and labels them like specimens in a museum. All that was visible within the bronze gates was a gloomy-looking room, separated by a wall from the vault itself. The 2 doors before mentioned were in the middle of this wall, and enclosed the Villefort and Saint-Méran coffins. Their grief might freely expend itself without being disturbed by the trifling loungers who came from a picnic party to visit Père Lachaise, or by lovers who made it their rendezvous. The 2 coffins were placed on trestles previously prepared to their reception in the right-hand crypt belonging to the Saint-Méran family. Villefort, Franz, and a few near relatives alone entered the sanctuary. As the religious ceremonies had all been performed at the door, and there was no address given, the party all separated. Château Renaud, Albert, and Morrel went one way, and Debray and Beauchamp the other. Franz remained with Monsieur de Villefort at the gate of the cemetery. Morrel made an excuse to wait. He saw Franz and Monsieur de Villefort get into the same mourning coach, and thought this meeting foreboded evil. He then returned to Paris, and although in the same carriage with Château Renaud and Albert, he did not hear one word of their conversation. As Franz was about to take leave of Monsieur de Villefort, "When shall I see you again?" said the latter. "At what time you please, sir," replied Franz. "As soon as possible." "I am at your command, sir. Shall we return together?" "If not unpleasant to you." "On the contrary, I shall feel much pleasure." Thus the future father and son-in-law stepped into the same carriage, and Morrel, seeing them pass, became uneasy. Villefort and Franz returned to the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. The procureur, without going to see either his wife or his daughter, went at once to his study, and offering the young man a chair, "Monsieur d'Épinay," said he, "allow me to remind you at this moment, which is perhaps not so ill-chosen as at first sight may appear, for obedience to the wishes of the departed is the first offering which should be made at their tomb. Allow me then to remind you of the wish expressed by Madame de Saint-Méran on her deathbed, that Valentine's wedding might not be deferred. You know the affairs of the deceased are in perfect order, and her will bequeaths to Valentine the entire property of the Saint-Méran family. The notary showed me the documents yesterday, which will enable us to draw up the contract immediately. You may call on the notary, Monsieur Deschamps, Place Beauvau, Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and you have my authority to inspect those deeds." "Sir," replied Monsieur d'Épinay, "it is not, perhaps, the moment for Mademoiselle Valentine, who is in deep distress, to think of her husband. Indeed, I fear—" "Valentine will have no greater pleasure than that of fulfilling her grandmother's last injunctions. There will be no obstacle from that quarter, I assure you." "In that case," replied Franz, "as I shall raise none, you may make arrangements when you please. I have pledged my word, and shall feel pleasure and happiness in adhering to it." "Then," said Villefort, "nothing further is required. The contract was to have been signed 3 days since. We shall find it all ready and can sign it today." "But the morning," said Franz, hesitating. "Don't be uneasy on that score," replied Villefort. "No ceremony will be neglected in my house. Mademoiselle de Villefort may retire during the prescribed 3 months to her estate of Saint-Méran. I say hers, for she inherits it today. There, after a few days, if you like, the civil marriage shall be celebrated without pomp or ceremony. Madame de Saint-Méran wished her daughter should be married there. When that is over, you, sir, can return to Paris, while your wife passes the time of her mourning with her mother-in-law." "As you please, sir," said Franz. "Then," replied Monsieur de Villefort, "have the kindness to wait half an hour. Valentine shall come down into the drawing-room. I will send Monsieur Deschamps. We will read and sign the contract before we separate. And this evening Madame de Villefort shall accompany Valentine to her estate, where we will rejoin them in a week." "Sir," said Franz, "I have one request to make." "What is it?" "I wish Albert de Morcerf and Raoul de Châteaurenaud to be present at this signature. You know they are my witnesses." "Half an hour will suffice to apprise them. Will you go for them yourself, or shall you send?" "I prefer going, sir." "I shall expect you then in half an hour, Baron, and Valentine will be ready." Franz bowed and left the room. Scarcely had the door closed when Monsieur de Villefort sent to tell Valentine to be ready in the drawing-room in half an hour, as he expected the notary and Monsieur d'Épinay and his witnesses. The news caused a great sensation throughout the house. Madame de Villefort would not believe it, and Valentine was thunderstruck. She looked around for help, and would have gone down to her grandfather's room, but on the stairs she met Monsieur de Villefort, who took her arm and led her into the drawing-room. In the ante-room Valentine met Barrois, and looked despairingly at the old servant. A moment later Madame de Villefort entered the drawing-room with her little Edward. It was evident that she had shared the grief of the family, for she was pale and looked fatigued. She sat down, took Edward on her knees, and from time to time pressed this child, on whom her affections appeared centred, almost convulsively to her bosom. 2 carriages were soon heard to enter the courtyard. One was the notary's, the other that of Franz and his friends. In a moment the whole party was assembled. Valentine was so pale one might trace the blue veins from her temples, round her eyes and down her cheeks. Franz was deeply affected. Château-Renaud and Albert looked at each other with amazement. The ceremony, which was just concluded, had not appeared more sorrowful than did that which was about to begin. Madame de Villefort had placed herself in the shadow behind a velvet curtain, and as she constantly bent over her child, it was difficult to read the expression of her face. Monsieur de Villefort was, as usual, unmoved. The notary, after having, according to the customary method, arranged the papers on the table, taken his place in an armchair, and raised his spectacles, turned towards Franz. "Are you Monsieur Franz de Quesnel, Baron d'Épinay?" asked he, although he knew it perfectly. "Yes, sir," replied Franz. The notary bowed. "I have then to inform you, sir, at the request of Monsieur de Villefort, that your projected marriage with Mademoiselle de Villefort has changed the feeling of Monsieur Noirtier towards his grandchild, and that he disinherits her entirely of the fortune he would have left her. Let me hasten to add," continued he, "that the testator, having only the right to alienate a part of his fortune, and having alienated it all, the will not bear scrutiny and is declared null and void." "Yes," said Villefort, "but I warn Monsieur d'Épinay that during my lifetime my father's will shall never be questioned, my position forbidding any doubt to be entertained." "Sir," said Franz, "I regret much that such a question has been raised in the presence of Mademoiselle Valentine. I have never inquired the amount of her fortune, which, however limited it may be, exceeds mine. My family has sought consideration in this alliance with Monsieur de Villefort. All I seek is happiness." Valentine imperceptibly thanked him, while two silent tears rolled down her cheeks. "Besides, sir," said Villefort, addressing himself to his future son-in-law, "excepting the loss of a portion of your hopes, this unexpected will not need to personally wound you. Monsieur Noirtier's weakness of mind sufficiently explains it. It is not because Mademoiselle Valentine is going to marry you that he is angry, but because she will marry. A union with any other would have caused him the same sorrow. Old age is selfish, sir, and Mademoiselle de Villefort has been a faithful companion to Monsieur Noirtier, which she cannot be when she becomes the Baroness d'Épinay. My father's melancholy state prevents our speaking to him on any subjects which the weakness of his mind would incapacitate him from understanding, and I am perfectly convinced that at the present time, although he knows that his granddaughter is going to be married, Monsieur Noirtier has ever forgotten the name of his intended grandson." Monsieur de Villefort had scarcely said this when the door opened and Barrois appeared. "Gentlemen," said he in a tone strangely firm for a servant speaking to his masters under such solemn circumstances, "Gentlemen, Monsieur Noirtier de Villefort wishes to speak immediately to Monsieur Franz de Quesnel, Baron d'Épinay." He, as well as the notary, that there might be no mistake in the person, gave all his titles to the bridegroom-elect. Villefort started. Madame de Villefort let her son slip from her knees. Valentine rose, pale and dumb as a statue. Albert and Chateau Renaud exchanged a second look, more full of amazement than the first. The notary looked at Villefort. "It is impossible," said the procureur. "Monsieur d'Épinay cannot leave the drawing-room at present." "It is at this moment," replied Barrois with the same firmness, "that Monsieur Noirtier, my master, wishes to speak on important subjects to Monsieur Franz d'Épinay." "Grandpapa Noirtier can speak now, then," said Edward with his habitual quickness. However, his remark did not make Madame de Villefort even smile, so much was every mind engaged, and so solemn was the situation. Astonishment was at its height. Something like a smile was perceptible on Madame de Villefort's countenance. Valentine instinctively raised her eyes, as if to thank heaven. "Pray go, Valentine," said Monsieur de Villefort, "and see what this new fancy of your grandfather's is." Valentine rose quickly, and was hastening joyfully towards the door, when Monsieur de Villefort altered his intention. "Stop," said he. "I will go with you."
"Excuse me, sir," said Franz. "Since Monsieur Noirtier sent for me, I am ready to attend to his wish. Besides, I shall be happy to pay my respects to him, not having yet had the honour of doing so." "Pray, sir," said Villefort, with marked uneasiness, "do not disturb yourself." "Forgive me, sir," said Franz, in a resolute tone. "I would not lose this opportunity of proving to Monsieur Noirtier how wrong it would be of him to encourage feelings of dislike to me, which I am determined to conquer, whatever they may be, by my devotion." And without listening to Villefort, he arose and followed Valentine, who was running downstairs with the joy of a shipwrecked mariner who finds a rock to cling to. Monsieur de Villefort followed them. Château Renaud and Morcerf exchanged a third look of still increasing wonder. End of chapter 74.
Chapter 75 of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 75. A signed statement. Noirtier was prepared to receive them, dressed in black and installed in his armchair. When the three persons he expected had entered, he looked at the door, which his valet immediately closed. "Listen," whispered Villefort to Valentine, who could not conceal her joy. "If Monsieur Noirtier wishes to communicate anything which would delay your marriage, I forbid you to understand him." Valentine blushed, but did not answer. Villefort, approaching Noirtier, "Here is Monsieur Franz d'Épinay," said he. "You requested to see him. We have all wished for this interview, and I trust it will convince you how ill-informed are your objections to Valentine's marriage." Noirtier answered only by a look which made Villefort's blood run cold. He motioned to Valentine to approach. In a moment, thanks to her habit of conversing with her grandfather, she understood that he asked for a key. Then his eye was fixed on the drawer of a small chest between the windows. She opened the drawer and found a key, and understanding that was what he wanted, again watched his eyes, which turned towards an old secretary which had been neglected for many years, and was supposed to contain nothing but useless documents. "Shall I open the secretary?" asked Valentine. "Yes," said the old man. "And the drawers?" "Yes." "Those at the side?" "No." "The middle one?" "Yes." Valentine opened it and drew out a bundle of papers. "Is that what you wish for?" asked she. "No." She took successively all the other papers out till the drawer was empty. "But there are no more," said she. Noirtier's eye was fixed on the dictionary. "Yes, I understand, grandfather," said the young girl. He pointed to each letter of the alphabet. At the letter S, the old man stopped her. She opened and found the word secret. "Ah, is there a secret spring?" said Valentine. "Yes," said Noirtier. "And who knows it?" Noirtier looked at the door where the servant had gone out. "Barrois?" said she. "Yes." "Shall I call him?" "Yes." Valentine went to the door and called Barrois. Villefort's impatience during this scene made the perspiration roll from his forehead, and Franz was stupefied. The old servant came. "Barrois," said Valentine, "my grandfather has told me to open that drawer in the secretary, but there is a secret spring in it, which you know. Will you open it?" Barrois looked at the old man. "Obey," said Noirtier's intelligent eye. Barrois touched a spring, the false bottom came out, and they saw a bundle of papers tied with a black string. "Is that what you wish for?" said Barrois. "Yes." "Shall I give these papers to Monsieur de Villefort?" "No." "To Mademoiselle Valentine?" "No." "To Monsieur Franz d'Épinay?" "Yes." Franz, astonished, advanced a step. "To me, sir?" said he. "Yes." Franz took them from Barrois, and casting a glance at the cover, read, "To be given after my death, to General Durand, who shall bequeath the packet to his son, with an injunction to preserve it as containing an important document." "Well, sir," asked Franz, "what do you wish me to do with this paper?" "To preserve it, sealed up as it is, doubtless," said the procureur. "No," replied Noirtier eagerly. "Do you wish him to read it?" said Valentine. "Yes," replied the old man. "You understand, Baron, my grandfather wishes you to read this paper," said Valentine. "Then let us sit down," said Villefort impatiently, "for it would take some time." "Sit down," said the old man. Villefort took a chair, but Valentine remained standing by her father's side, and Franz before him, holding the mysterious paper in his hand. "Read," said the old man. Franz untied it, and in the midst of the most profound silence read, "Extract from the report of a meeting of the Bonapartist Club in the Rue Saint-Jacques, held February 5th, 1815. Franz stopped. "February 5th, 1815?" said he. "It is the day my father was murdered." Valentine and Villefort were dumb. The eye of the old man alone seemed to say clearly, "Go on." "But it was on leaving this club," said he, "my father disappeared." Noirtier's eyes continued to say, "Read." He resumed. "The undersigned Louis-Jacques Beaupère, Lieutenant-Colonel of Artillery, Etienne d'Auchampy, General of the Brigade, and Claude Lecharpal, Keeper of the Woods and Forests, declare that on the 4th of February a letter arrived from the island of Elba, recommending to the kindness and the confidence of the Bonapartist Club General Flavien de Quesnel, who, having served the Emperor from 1804 to 1814, was supposed to be devoted to the interests of the Napoleon dynasty, notwithstanding the title of Baron, which Louis XVIII had just granted to him with his estate of Épinay. A note was in consequence addressed to General de Quesnel, begging him to be present at the meeting next day, the 5th. The note indicated neither the street nor the number of the house where the meeting was to be held. It bore no signature, but it announced to the general that someone would call for him if he would be ready at 9 o'clock. The meetings were always held from that time till midnight. At 9 o'clock the president of the club presented himself. The general was ready. The president informed him that one of the conditions of his introduction was that he should be eternally ignorant of the place of the meeting, and that he would allow his eyes to be bandaged, swearing that he would not endeavor to take off the bandage. General de Quesnel accepted the condition, and promised on his honor not to seek to discover the road they took. The general's carriage was ready, but the president told him it was impossible for him to use it, since it was useless to blindfold the master if the coachman knew through what streets he went. "What must be done, then?" asked the general. "I have my carriage here," said the president. "Have you then so much confidence in your servant that you can entrust him with a secret you will not allow me to know?" "Our coachman is a member of the club," said the president. "We shall be driven by a state councillor." "Then we run another risk," said the general, laughing, "that of being upset." We insert this joke to prove that the general was not in the least compelled to attend the meeting, but that he came willingly. When they were seated in the carriage, the president reminded the general of his promise to allow his eyes to be bandaged, to which he made no opposition. On the road, the president thought he saw the general make an attempt to remove the handkerchief, and reminded him of his oath. "Sure enough," said the general. The carriage stopped at an alley leading out of the Rue Saint-Jacques. The general alighted, leaning on the arm of the president, of whose dignity he was not aware, considering him simply as a member of the club. They went through the alley, mounted a flight of stairs, and entered the assembly room. The deliberations had already begun. The members, apprised of the sort of presentation which was to be made that evening, were all in attendance. When, in the middle of the room, the general was invited to remove his bandage, he did so immediately, and was surprised to see so many well-known faces in a society of whose existence he had till then been ignorant. They questioned him as to his sentiments, but he contented himself with answering that the letters from the island of Elba ought to have informed them. Franz interrupted himself by saying, "My father was a royalist. They need not have asked his sentiments, which were well known." "And hence," said Villefort, "arose my affection for your father, my dear Monsieur Franz. Opinions held in common are a ready bond of union." "Read again," said the old man. Franz continued. The President then sought to make him speak more explicitly, but Monsieur de Quesnel replied that he wished first to know what they wanted with him. He was then informed of the contents of the letter from the island of Elba, in which he was recommended to the club as a man who would be likely to advance the interests of their party. One paragraph spoke of the return of Bonaparte, and promised another letter and further details on the arrival of the Pharaon belonging to the shipbuilder Morel of Marseille, whose captain was entirely devoted to the Emperor. During all this time, the general on whom they thought to have relied as on a brother manifested evidently signs of discontent and repugnance. When the reading was finished, he remained silent, with knitted brows. "Well," asked the President, "what do you say to this letter, General?" "I say that it is too soon after declaring myself for Louis XVIII to break my vow in behalf of the ex-Emperor." This answer was too clear to permit of any mistake as to his sentiments. "General," said the President, "we acknowledge no King Louis XVIII or an ex-Emperor, but His Majesty the Emperor and King driven from France, which is his kingdom by violence and treason." "Excuse me, gentlemen," said the general. "You may not acknowledge Louis XVIII, but I do, as he has made me a baron and a field marshal, and I shall never forget that for these two titles I am indebted to his happy return to France." "Sir," said the President, rising with gravity, "be careful what you say. Your words clearly show us that they are deceived concerning you in the island of Elba, and have deceived us. The communication has been made to you in consequence of the confidence placed in you, and which does you honor. Now we discover our error. A title and promotion attach you to the government which we wish to overturn. We will not constrain you to help us. We enroll no one against his conscience, but we will compel you to act generously, even if you are not disposed to do so." "You could call acting generously knowing your conspiracy and not informing against you. That is what I should call becoming your accomplice. You see, I am more candid than you." "Ah, my father," said Franz, interrupting himself, "I understand now why they murdered him." Valentine could not help casting one glance toward the young man, whose filial enthusiasm it was delightful to behold. Villefort walked to and fro behind them. Noirtier watched the expression of each one, and preserved his dignified and commanding attitude. Franz returned to the manuscript and continued. "Sir," said the President, "you have been invited to join this assembly. You were not forced here. It was proposed to you to come blindfolded. You accepted. When you complied with this twofold request, you well knew we did not wish to secure the throne of Louis XVIII, or we should not take so much care to avoid the vigilance of the police. It would be conceding too much to allow you to put on a mask to aid you in the discovery of our secret, and then to remove it that you may ruin those who have confided in you. No, no, you must first say if you declare yourself for the king of a day who now reigns, or for his Majesty the Emperor." "I am a royalist," replied the general. "I have taken the oath of allegiance to Louis XVIII.
and I will adhere to it." These words were followed by a general murmur, and it was evident that several of the members were discussing the propriety of making the general repent of his rashness. The president again arose, and having imposed silence, said, "Sir, you are too serious and too sensible a man not to understand the consequences of our present situation, and your candour has already dictated to us the conditions which remain for us to offer you." The general, putting his hand on his sword, exclaimed, "If you talk of honour, do not begin by disavowing its laws and impose nothing by violence." "And you, sir," continued the president, with a calmness still more terrible than the general's anger, "I advise you not to touch your sword." The general looked around with slight uneasiness. However, he did not yield, but calling up all his fortitude, said, "I will not swear." "Then you must die," replied the president calmly. Monsieur d'Épinay became very pale. He looked round him for a second time. Several members of the club were whispering and getting their arms from under their cloaks. "General," said the president, "do not alarm yourself. You are among men of honour, who will use every means to convince you before resorting to the last extremity. But as you have said you are among conspirators, you are in possession of our secret, and you must restore it to us." A significant silence followed these words, and as the general did not reply, "Close the doors," said the president to the doorkeeper. The same deadly silence succeeded these words. Then the general advanced, and making a violent effort to control his feelings, "I have a son," said he, "and I ought to think of him, finding myself among assassins." "General," said the chief of the assembly, "one man may insult 50. It is the privilege of weakness, but he does wrong to use his privilege. Follow my advice. Swear, and do not insult." The general, again daunted by the superiority of the chief, hesitated a moment, then advancing to the president's desk, "What is the form?" said he. "It is this: I swear by my honour not to reveal to anyone what I have seen and heard on the 5th of February, 1815, between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening, and I plead guilty of death should I ever violate this oath." The general appeared to be affected by a nervous tremor, which prevented his answering for some moments. Then, overcoming his manifest repugnance, he pronounced the required oath, but in so low a tone as to be scarcely audible to the majority of the members, who insisted on his repeating it clearly and distinctly, which he did. "Now, am I at liberty to retire?" said the general. The president arose, appointed 3 members to accompany him, and got into the carriage with the general after bandaging his eyes. One of those 3 members was the coachman who had driven them there. The other members silently dispersed. "Where do you wish to be taken?" asked the president. "Anywhere out of your presence," replied Monsieur d'Épinay. "Beware, sir," replied the president. "You are no longer in the assembly, and have only to do with individuals. Do not insult them unless you wish to be held responsible." But instead of listening, Monsieur d'Épinay went on, "You are still as brave in your carriage as in your assembly, because you are still 4 against 1. The president stopped the coach. They were at the part of the Quai des Ormes where the steps lead down to the river. "Why do you stop here?" asked d'Épinay. "Because, sir," said the president, "you have insulted a man, and that man will not go one step farther without demanding honourable reparation." "Another method of assassination," said the general, shrugging his shoulders. "Make no noise, sir, unless you wish me to consider you as one of the men of whom you spoke just now as cowards, who take their weakness for a shield." You are alone. One alone shall answer you. You have a sword by your side. I have one in my cane. You have no witness. One of these gentlemen will serve you. Now, if you please, remove your bandage." The general tore the handkerchief from his eyes. "At last," said he, "I shall know with whom I have to do." They opened the door, and the four men alighted. Franz again interrupted himself and wiped the cold drops from his brow. There was something awful in hearing the son read aloud in trembling pallor these details of his father's death which had hitherto been a mystery. Valentine clasped her hands as if in prayer. Noirtier looked at Villefort with an almost sublime expression of contempt and pride. Franz continued. "It was, as we said, the 5th of February. For 3 days the mercury had been 5 or 6 degrees below freezing, and the steps were covered with ice. The general was stout and tall. The president offered him the side of the railing to assist him in getting down. The 2 witnesses followed. It was a dark night. The ground from the steps to the river was covered with snow and hoarfrost. The water of the river looked black and deep. One of the seconds went for a lantern in a coal barge near, and by its light they examined the weapons. The president's sword, which was simply, as he had said, one he carried in his cane, was 5 inches shorter than the general's and had no guard. The general proposed to cast lots for the swords, but the president said it was he who had given the provocation, and when he had given it, he had supposed each would use his own arms. The witnesses endeavored to insist, but the president bade them be silent. The lantern was placed on the ground. The 2 adversaries took their stations, and the duel began. The light made the 2 swords appear like flashes of lightning. As for the men, they were scarcely perceptible. The darkness was so great. General d'Épinay passed for one of the best swordsmen in the army, but he was pressed so closely in the onset that he missed his aim and fell. The witnesses thought he was dead, but his adversary, who knew he had not struck him, offered him the assistance of his hand to rise. The circumstance irritated instead of calming the general, and he rushed on his adversary. But his opponent did not allow his guard to be broken. He received him on his sword, and 3 times the general drew back on finding himself too closely engaged, and then returned to the charge. At the 3rd, he fell again. They thought he slipped, as at first, and the witnesses, seeing he did not move, approached and endeavored to raise him. But the one who passed his arm around the body found it was moistened with blood. The general, who had almost fainted, revived. "Ah," said he, "they have sent some fencing master to fight with me." The president, without answering, approached the witness who held the lantern, and raising his sleeve, showed him 2 wounds he had received in his arm. Then opening his coat and unbuttoning his waistcoat, displayed his side, pierced with a 3rd wound. Still, he had not even uttered a sigh. General d'Épinay died 5 minutes after. Franz read these last words in a voice so choked that they were hardly audible, and then stopped, passing his hand over his eyes as if to dispel a cloud. But after a moment's silence, he continued. The president went up the steps, after pushing his sword into his cane. A track of blood on the snow marked his course. He had scarcely arrived at the top when he heard a heavy splash in the water. It was the general's body, which the witnesses had just thrown into the river, after ascertaining that he was dead. The general fell, then, in a loyal duel, and not in ambush, as it might have been reported. In proof of this, we have signed this paper to establish the truth of the facts, lest the moment should arrive when either of the actors in this terrible scene should be accused of premeditated murder or of infringement of the laws of honor. Signed, Beaurepaire, Deschamps, and Le Charpal. When France had finished reading this account, so dreadful for a son, when Valentine, pale with emotion, had wiped away a tear, when Villefort, trembling and crouched in a corner, had endeavoured to lessen the storm by supplicating glances at the implacable old man. "Sir," said d'Épinay to Noirtier, "since you are well acquainted with all these details, which are attested by honourable signatures, since you appear to take some interest in me, although you have only manifested it hitherto by causing me sorrow, refuse me not one final satisfaction. Tell me the name of the president of the club, that I may at least know who killed my father." Villefort mechanically felt for the handle of the door. Valentine, who understood sooner than anyone her grandfather's answer, and who had often seen 2 scars upon his right arm, drew back a few steps. "Mademoiselle," said Franz, returning towards Valentine, "unite your efforts with mine to find out the name of the man who made me an orphan at 2 years of age." Valentine remained dumb and motionless. "Hold, sir," said Villefort. "Do not prolong this dreadful scene. The names have been purposely concealed. My father himself does not know who his president was, and if he knows, he cannot tell you. Proper names are not in the dictionary." "Oh, misery!" cried Franz. "The only hope which sustained me and enabled me to read to the end was that of knowing at least the name of him who killed my father. Sir, sir," cried he, turning to Noirtier, "do what you can. Make me understand in some way." "Yes," replied Noirtier. "Oh, mademoiselle, mademoiselle!" cried Franz. "Your grandfather says he can indicate the person. Help me, lend me your assistance." Noirtier looked at the dictionary. Franz took it with a nervous trembling and repeated the letters of the alphabet successfully, until he came to M. At that letter the old man signified yes. "M," repeated Franz. The young man's finger glided over the words, but at each one Noirtier answered by a negative sign. Valentine hid her head between her hands. At length Franz arrived at the word. "Myself." "Yes." "You!" cried Franz, whose hair stood on end. "You, Monsieur Noirtier! You killed my father?" "Yes," replied Noirtier. Fixing a majestic look on the young man, Franz fell powerless on a chair. Villefort opened the door and escaped, for the idea had entered his mind to stifle the little remaining life in the heart of this terrible old man. End of chapter 75.